This is a sound check. Hi, this is András Baneth speaking on behalf of EU Training. And before I begin, I'll just like to wait for a confirmation from Lenka that the sound is working as it should. Does it? Yes, the sound has been confirmed to be working, so hopefully all of you can hear me very well. So a warm welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us on EU Training on today's webcast, which is about the 2018 EPSO administrators in the field of data protection, and it's an information webcast. So we'll spend the next 45 to 50 minutes covering this very exciting opportunity, and we will be covering a lot of ground in these 50 minutes. Your questions are more than welcome. And please feel free to type that into the chat box. And Lenka will be kind enough to convey them to me so I can answer those real time. When there are questions that I can't answer or there is no time for it, then I'll be very happy to follow up in one form or another, whether through an article that's shared with everyone or individually if you have a very specific question that's unique to you. So with that in mind, that's me. A few years ago when I looked less tired and less exhausted than today, and hopefully I'll be able to bring all the expertise that I've gained over the years regarding EPSO exams, and I'll be very glad to share that with you to make sure that you do perform very well at the exam to the extent that you will succeed, get on the reserve list, and become a data protection officer or official in the EU. In case you miss anything today, then we will be sharing the recording with you after the webcast, and you'll be also getting the Prezi slides, the one that you see on the screen, both in this nice zoomable format and perhaps even in PDF, so you can print those or review those and get the best and the most information that you need. We'll also provide a transcript of this webcast, so mark my words, with the caveat, with the disclaimer that whatever I say tries to be as accurate as humanly possible, but I am not EPSO, I'm not the European Personnel Selection Office, so please double check all the information that we'll be sharing here with you, because the official source is only what you see on EPSO's website and various forms of communication, most notably the notice of competition and the official journal of the EU. So with that in mind, a few words about our community, of which you are probably a member of, but if not, make sure to join. We've got over 80,000 registered users over the past 10 years who've used our services or got in touch with us in one way or another. We've got a great community on Facebook, over 50,000 fans, so do join that. We share a lot of valuable, up-to-date information there, and there's great interaction related to all the exams and competitions. Now, we also have test packages, as you may have seen. We have an enormous question database that we're constantly updating and refreshing and improving. And then interesting piece of information is that over 17 million questions have been used by our customers and our clients, which is pretty impressive, I find, because there are just it's just so many combinations of exams that you can practice for and improve your performance. In that regard, we also have webinars which help you prepare over 100 hours of recordings. Some are paid, some are completely free, and we've had over 5,000 participants over the year. Now, with that in mind, we also have a special exclusive offer for those of you participating until the end, and we'll be glad to extend that offer for all of our online test preparation packages, so it will be a very special discount code with a time-limited offer. So with that, let's get started and let's talk briefly about the job and things that surround the job or are things that are linked to the future post that you'll be holding as an EU data protection officer. First question is probably, where will you work? You might be wondering about that because EU institutions, agencies, representations, delegations are present throughout Europe and the world. For this particular competition, it's almost certainly Brussels where you're going to work. very unlikely that you'll have a post in Luxembourg, and even less likely to have it in Strasbourg, because you'll be linked to the European Data Protection Supervisor, or at least in administrative terms. So you might end up in Luxembourg, but as I said, there's far bigger chance, almost a certainty, that the place of work will be in Brussels. With that in mind, you might be wondering which institution or agency or body you'll be placed with or you'll be working for. The selection process is as the name suggests, it's a selection system. This is not recruitment. So at the beginning, when you get started with this whole procedure and you've signed up and the exams are coming up, you are being selected to be placed on the reserve list. The actual recruitment happens at the moment of recruitment. I know it's a little bit self-explanatory in the sense that you are placed on the reserve list, and the recruitment, the decision to hire you to work for one of the institutions, takes place only at that moment. So you do not necessarily know in advance where you're going to be working at. So the European Data Protection Supervisor would be the umbrella, the administrative organization to which you are linked, but you might be placed for the actual job you are performing in another EU institution, working with EU officials and the procedures and the processes of other institutions that you can see on the screen. So as I mentioned before, it's decided at the time of the recruitment. How many places are there? This is public information that you can find in the official journal, and you will see that there are 30 places available on the reserve list. There's no guarantee that there will be 30 people hired, so that's something to bear in mind, but the aim is to hire everyone who gets placed on the reserve list. So that gives a strong indication to you that your chances are fairly high, because it's not 1 or 2 or 5 spots, there are 30. Obviously, you need to know how many candidates there are, because that's what truly determines your chances of success. But it's a strong indication that they have a great need to hire a lot of data protection officers. Application deadline is next Tuesday, 11th of September. So make sure that you are fully aware of that deadline. You do not submit your application the last moment. The servers tend to crash. Do not do that. Make sure you sign up, you fill in everything you need to before that time. And especially because there's a talent screener, and the talent screener is something we'll spend a few minutes on. It takes a lot of time to fill in and to properly provide all the information that you need. So going further, let's look at some of the practicalities and detailed information about the application. Let's see first the general conditions, which is almost the same for every EPSO run selection process. You need to be an EU citizen, one of the 28 states, right now 28, so even Brits are more than welcome to apply at this point. You need to have completed military service if that's compulsory in your country of citizenship, and you need to meet the character requirements for the duties concerned. So if you have a criminal track record or other, that may be a problem. When it comes to languages, it's very important that you keep in mind these rules. It will determine in which language you should practice the tests, the exams, to make sure you can increase your chances of success. And it will determine your preparation strategy, because if you are, say, Swedish, and you are sitting the first 3 tests, the abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning test in English, and then you choose as language to French, that might have an impact on your performance and the way you approach the various exercises. So with that in mind, let's take a look. What's language 1? What's language 2? Language 1 can be any of the EU's 24 official languages, and it's not linked to your citizenship. That's a very important point, because regardless which citizenship, which passport you hold, you can choose any of these 24 languages. If you happen to be Latvian, but you grew up in Spain, so you almost consider Spanish as your mother tongue, or you're more fluent in that language, you are absolutely free to choose that language. Language 2 must be either English or French and different from language 1. So for most of those, most candidates, and I presume most of you, it would likely be language 1 is linked to the country of your origin or where you grew up, and then language 2 would most probably be English, and to a smaller number of you, it might be French. But again, if you are very confident and very fluent in English, and you can take verbal reasoning tests even faster than in your mother tongue being one of the EU's 24 official languages, you can choose language 1 as English and then language 2 French. So that's okay. Here's a quick summary of all those 24 languages, and you might recognize some special ones like Irish, which is an official language, and you may be missing Luxembourgish, which is not an official EU language. And then in terms of language 2 is what I mentioned, that it has to be English and French and different from the first one. In terms of qualifications and work experience, that's an important part because this is a formal requirement, and if you do not meet it, you will need to, or not need to, but you will be disqualified from the competition. So that's a very important piece that you must meet, a very important requirement that you must meet. So let's take a look. What are your two possibilities? The first one is to have a degree in law from either an EU university, officially recognized accredited university, or if it's from outside the EU, you might need to get a formal recognition by a member state's public authority that your degree is equivalent to an EU degree. So as long as you have basically a bachelor's, a BA in law, which is 3 years of legal studies, that's one part of it, and you need to have 3 years of appropriate professional experience in the legal field. So 3 years work experience in the legal field, of which a year and a half has to be linked to the development or application of data protection law in public administration. So that might be a challenge for some of you, that you may have dealt with data protection in a law firm or in a corporate setting as an in-house counsel, but it didn't have much to do with public administration. So that's an important precondition. You need to prove some interaction, at least a year and a half interaction with data protection in public administration. Option number 2 could be to have a 3-year degree. So again, a bachelor, a BA degree in any field. So whether that's biology, nuclear science, or engineering, doesn't matter. So 3 years university degree. And then 3 years of appropriate professional experience in the legal field in the development, or of which a year and a half is the development of application of data protection law, again, in public administration. So either a legal degree and then 3 years legal experience, or any degree and then 3 years legal field or legal experience and linked to a public administration. So as long as you meet either of these criteria, either being the one on the top box or the one in the second box, but it has to be always 3 years plus 3 years. As long as you meet that, you are formally eligible for this competition. As a result, if and when you succeed and you are recruited, you'll be placed on a so-called 86 level, which is not the entry level. Entry level is 85. This one is 86. It's a higher rank with more salary and some a little higher level of responsibility. We have a salary calculator simulator on our website. So if you're interested in the expected salary, if that's a source of motivation for you, which I believe it is, you might want to find out the exact salary. But roughly speaking, an 86 EU official earns a fairly good salary, or more than fairly good, a very good salary, of roughly 5,000 euros net. So depending on where you might be coming from, on purchase power parity, it's worth more, usually in Central and Eastern Europe. If you live in Brussels, it's worth a little less, but still it's considered a very competitive, very attractive salary. So with that in mind, let's go on and just a few words of why it's a good opportunity if you have not been convinced of that yet. So the salary is attractive, as we just discussed. And when it comes to benefits, you have a very good, very solid health insurance plan linked to the benefits of the work. And if you're married, then your spouse is also covered. Your children are also covered. And there are European schools where you might want to sign your kids up, which offer education in the EU's languages. So depending on where you're coming from and where your spouse or partner is coming from, you can get education which is similar or almost the same as the national education in your home country. And when it comes to the actual exam, let's look at a couple specific things you might want to consider. The first one is the pre-selection phase, and it's something that I'll go into more details. The pre-selection phase is where the exam starts. So the pre-selection phase has a special scoring, and it's something I'll come back to and reinforce when we get to the more detailed parts. But the pre-selection has a verbal, abstract, and numerical reasoning test. This has a special marking, special scores. So the verbal reasoning has a pass mark of 50%. You need to get at least half of the answers right. And the numerical and abstract reasoning have a combined pass mark of 50%. But again, this is something we'll come back to when we go through the steps one by one, so you understand better how to get one of these jobs and how you can succeed in the competition. I see here is a question coming in, so let me quickly answer that. So in case of not having worked for at least 1.5 years for a public authority, we are not eligible. My interpretation, and again, that's the caveat that this is my understanding, that you might want to check with the selection board or EPSO itself. You do not need to have worked with a public authority as a civil servant or as an in-house, so being a government official. Maybe you were working in a data protection office which was linked to the ombudsman of your country. Or maybe you dealt with perhaps that might be subject to interpretation or a borderline case if you were in an academic institute that had a government contract or something that was closely linked to the government or a government funded or publicly funded body that dealt with privacy issues, and you were a researcher there or you were a legal counsel in that institute, that might qualify as working on public administration related data protection matters. So again, with the disclaimer that that this is my interpretation, you are not limited to simply being a former government official dealing with data protection, but working around that area might qualify you as well. So this is something that might require you to send an email to EPSO and get some guidance whether that works or not. Or in a worst case, you fill in the application, you fill in the talent screener, and you hope that the answers and the information you provided will convince them that you qualify. So there's more time and efforts to be invested in this case because you don't know in advance. But if you have that background and that's close enough, I would encourage you to apply because hopefully that will convince them that you are eligible. So let's go further and look at the application process and the so-called talent screener. This competition is a so-called specialist competition. What makes a specialist competition a bit unique? Essentially one thing, and that thing is the talent screener. The talent screener, and let me go straight to this point, what is a talent screener? It's a Q&A form, a questionnaire of sorts, that you need to fill out and provide answers where you are given the opportunity to talk about your professional background, your experience, and your expertise in the field, and convince the selection board members that you qualify for the job. So a talent screener is sort of a guided interview or a guided way to get more information about your professional background. You're not going to check your CV, you're not going to check your LinkedIn profile. The talent screener is your possibility to show off what you know and why that's relevant to the job and why you should be admitted to the competition. So the talent screener is scored in a way that there are many questions there, and each question is worth, or let's say each section is usually worth 0 to 3 points. And then they add up the points that you were given in each of those question segments. And then in the end, they do a ranking. And you need to have a minimum number of points in order to qualify for the competition. So how do you maximize your talent screener score? Many candidates think that this is not really possible because you either have a certain experience or you don't. On the other hand, you can do your best and you can showcase your knowledge. You can show off your knowledge in the best possible light. Luckily, there are a few articles on EU training that you can find, and I believe Lenke was kind enough to share that in like publicly, that you can search around. And you can find tips and tricks, ideas how to get the highest score in the talent screener while being accurate, fair, and truthful. And that's a very important part. So here's a snapshot, a couple of ideas that you might want to consider. The first one is try to answer yes to as many questions as possible. If they ask, do you have experience in this field? Do you have experience dealing with the following matters? Try to answer yes, and then back it up with truthful and relevant information. Think about your past experience, your thesis, your professional work, the briefings you've done, the reports you've drafted, the legal advice you've given to your superiors. All of this can be relevant information. Provide lots of valuable stuff. So give meaningful answers. Do not just go on and discuss things which may not be relevant to the given question. Use bullet points, use nice formatting, and try to be as accurate as possible. And be concrete. A lot of candidates that I've met and spoken with, they tend to be very abstract. They say, well, I have an immense experience in this field. Fantastic. But be careful with such adjectives as immense, great, vast, sound. None of this is very concrete. Give numbers. I worked 5 years on this project. I drafted 12 briefings on privacy of school kids when they interact with their peers on social networks. That's a very specific example. You put a number, you put a target group, you dealt with something very, very concrete. So make sure that you review the talent screener from that perspective. Readability, clear communication, I mentioned that a few moments before. Clear references, to the point descriptions, and nice formatting and layout. Because when they read that, and if you have a 2-page answer, that's not going to help you. It's just too verbose. You need to be to the point, but concrete enough. And the institutions and EPSO are very terminology driven. So they might look for very special keywords linked to the data protection field. Many of these keywords appear in the notice of competition. So you might want to review what their requirements are and try to reinforce it with your experience. And then finally, think about what's in it for them as if you were applying for a specific job. Make sure that you want to link your personal background with the EU, what the political and policy priorities of EU institutions are. Take a look at the annual report of the European Data Protection Supervisor. Take a look at some of the briefings or background materials that members of the European Parliament have been given or they themselves have drafted or tabled. Make sure that you use that language, that terminology, and it's reflected in your application. And actually, one more point, is do not copy paste previous answers. Even if the question seems to be repetitive or very similar to a previous one, I suggest you draft unique answers, or you can present the same case study or the same experience from a very different angle. Because if you worked for a government minister and you did certain briefings, maybe you also drafted some notes for other civil servants or other members of the public administration, not just your direct boss. So the same time you spent on a certain project, maybe you had also other assignments, so you can present those from a different angle. So going on to the next point, how the exam actually looks like. I mentioned the pre-selection part, the pre-selection tests, which is a little strange concept in the context of special or specialist competitions like this one. Why do I say that? I say this because the so-called pre-selection tests, so the abstract, numerical, and verbal reasoning tests, are used all the time. The difference is when or in which phase of the exam will they use these tests. Here is what I say. These tests may be used as a true pre-selection if there are lots of candidates for this competition. For the sake of example, again with the caveat, with the disclaimer that this is not a figure I know of, I'm using it for the sake of example. But if there's going to be, say, 400 or 500 applicants, EPSO and the selection board may decide, yes, we're going to do a pre-selection test, abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning, to reduce the number of candidates even before we look at the talent screener answers. But in case there aren't so many candidates, let's say, again, for the sake of example, there are 200, they say, well, it's a manageable amount. We're going to look at the talent screener. We're going to do a ranking on that basis. And we're going to invite everyone that we shortlisted to the assessment center. And it's only in the assessment center that you need to sit the abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning test. So these sort of tests are going to be part of the exam no matter what. The question is, are they truly used as a pre-selection, or are they used inside the assessment center? And that has an impact on your preparation strategy, because you may need to sit those tests and get a very high mark, a lot of points, high score, in order to just to get to the next stage, just to have your talent screener reviewed and get to the assessment center if there are lots of candidates. But if these three tests are part of the assessment center, you can afford not to perform so well. So your preparation, the timeline, and the strategy will be heavily impacted whether or not there are a lot of candidates, whether or not these three tests are part of the assessment center, or these are being held before the assessment center. What are these tests? Essentially, these three, the ones I mentioned, that you need to take in language 1, so one of the 24 EU official languages. Luckily, we at EU Training can offer you 16 languages, verbal reasoning in 16 languages, numerical reasoning in 3 languages, and abstract reasoning, well, language doesn't really play a role there, so that really doesn't matter. And we have thousands and thousands of tests in all these languages that you might want to try out. When it comes to the verbal reasoning, it's essentially 20 questions that you need to answer in 35 minutes. You see there's a very strong time pressure. There's always a text passage, a question, 4 statements, and only 1 correct answer. And they try to confuse you by inserting outside information which doesn't have anything to do with the text, with generalizations instead of a specific statement, confusing possibility and fact. So you might mix up which one is true and which one is hypothetical, and similar wording by using various synonyms or not so synonyms that may not reflect the same meaning of the text. So you choose from the various answer options, 4, sometimes 5, but most commonly 4 statements, which one is true. When it comes to numerical reasoning, very similar concept where you have 10 questions you need to answer in 20 minutes. you see that the timeline or the time pressure is very strong, 2 minutes per question, and there's a table like the one you see on the screen, and you need to pick the relevant pieces of information and then apply those, use those, and do some calculations and pick the right answer. So you need to interpret the data, do some reasoning, thinking, perhaps estimate to save time, or if estimation is not possible, then calculate and then pick the right answer. And then abstract reasoning is the cryptic pictures, images that follow a certain logic, a certain rule. And that's probably the hardest one because you have 10 questions in 10 minutes. So it's one question per minute, and you need to find the next in the row, the next in line. This is where I point back to my earlier message of how the scoring goes, where you have these 3 types of tests, and the scoring goes as follows. That verbal reasoning, you need to have at least every second answer correct. So at least 50% have to be correct. But for numerical and abstract reasoning, they combine the score. And if you completely mess up numerical reasoning and nail completely positively correctly answer all abstract reasoning questions, you can still pass. Bear in mind that you not only need to pass the objective pass mark, the one you see on the screen, the 50% and the combined 50% pass mark, but you need to be among the top candidates. So if you pass, but you are not among the top ones because your scores are not good enough, you can still be out from the competition, depending on how others have performed. So these tests are eliminatory and they do not count towards the overall final marks. So I'm not sure whether that's good news or bad news. It's something to bear in mind, but it's not going to impact your score in the assessment center when it comes to the measurement, to the evaluation of the so-called competencies. And those competencies are what we're going to talk about in a minute. But just to remind you of this step number 3, where the talent screener is being reviewed, and that's when the scores are being given. Again, depending on how many candidates were there, whether the abstract verbal numerical tests happened before or they are moved into the assessment center part. In the assessment center, you have 4 types of exams. One is a case study in your second language. And that's why it's so important to choose a second language, English or French, in which you're able to communicate in writing and in spoken language very well. So language 1 has to be more passive because you sit those abstract verbal numerical tests in language 1. But language 2 is more outward. It's more the oral expression, the written expression has to be really, really good. So you have a case study based on a background briefing. You have a group exercise with your fellow candidates, again, based on a background briefing. You have a so-called general competency-based interview. So that asks you for situations, so-called stories from your life, professional life, where you had to undergo a lot of stress, where you learned something new, where you were challenged by your colleagues, when you coordinated with a team. These are the general questions that you are given. And then there's a specific competency-based interview, which is based on the talent screener. So there they can ask you anything that you've written into the talent screener, but it's not a knowledge-based test. You are not being asked for your knowledge in data protection as such, but it's linked to the talent screener very specifically. How many people are invited to the assessment center? Approximately 3 times. So you do the maths, and it's 90 candidates, roughly 90 candidates who will be invited to the assessment center. And then you have the scoring in the assessment center. You have 8 competencies, such as leadership, working with others, resilience, communication, and a few others. Each competency is being evaluated through one of these exams that I've mentioned, and you are given a score. You can get 10 per each, so 80 in total, and you need to get at least 40 in total. and at least 3 per competency. So if you get 0 points on leadership, that's not going to make you eligible for the reserve list. So there has to be at least 50%. And then you have the specific competencies, the one that I mentioned linked to the talent screener. So that's another set of points, and you need to have at least 50 points out of 100. So altogether, if you are Mr. or Mrs. Perfect, then you can get 180 points, which doesn't happen to anyone, but you need to be just good enough to be among the top candidates. You don't need to be the best candidate, enough to be among the top candidates, so you are placed on the reserve list. And then there's the reserve list. The number of places we know, it's 30. It has a validity, usually more than a year for specialist competitions. So the validity is until a similar or same competition is announced. So for data protection, who knows? But most likely it will be valid for 2 years, perhaps longer. So do not worry how fast you are being recruited from that list. You will be fairly soon. And then there's the actual recruitment that we talked about. And how to get ready, a couple of general and specific ideas and tips. It's just like with any sport or language. It's a skill that you need to master. It's a skill you need to learn. So you need to invest time and effort and dedicated energy to practice. So make a plan, form a working group, get together with friends, motivate each other, and get started. Practice for 2 months or how long it's necessary, depending on your current skills and abilities. Prepare for 30 minutes every day, make it consistent, or you can do it every second or third day, doesn't matter, as long as you're following a specific rhythm. And learn methodology. This is not easy, it's not hard, but it's certainly not an enigma. It's not a mystery how to pass these competitions. There's lots of stuff online, and we at EU Training have hundreds and hundreds of articles, ebooks, workbooks, webinars, webcasts. You name the format, you will find it on our site, and most of it is actually completely free with transcripts and tons of information there that you can improve your methodology. And once you master that, your performance will go through the roof. It will improve so much because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to come up with your own ideas. There are set methods, very good methods that you can apply. And be persistent in the sense that you are not going to give up after a few days or weeks. Just keep going and make sure that you have your eyes on the target. Do lots of simulations when it comes to the abstract verbal numerical reasoning. But even for the assessment center, say the group exercise, we organize trainings, but you can get together with your friends and just do your own practice exercise. So you'll be fairly confident and familiar with the dynamics of a group discussion. You'll be familiar with how to draft an essay or the case study under a strict time limit. So do simulations, make sure that you are well acquainted with the speed, with the timing, and all the rest. We provide you all the tools that you can find online and that you need. 99% interface, 99% identical interface to the one that EPSO uses. So we've gone to great lengths to make sure that this really reflects the same system that they're using. So when you get to the exam center, you will not need to waste any moment getting familiar with the buttons, with the layout, and all the rest. Same thing for numerical reasoning. You have countless exercises, examples that you can use to practice. And the same thing with abstract reasoning, with some crazy, crazy difficult stuff. But I'm a strong believer in having a much tougher preparation and an easy exam than the other way around. So we'd rather present you with some pretty difficult challenges and pretty difficult exercises. So when you get to the exam, you'll say, oh, this was easy because I practiced with a very helpful tool. So do use the resources, the website. You can send us questions, and my colleagues and team, everyone else will be very happy to assist you, whether it's an administrative question, whether it's a technical question. Please let us know, and we'll be happy to connect with you and assist you. I mentioned the 16 languages that you can find on the website, from Croatian, Bulgarian, Greek, Spanish, Polish, many other languages for verbal reasoning. And for numerical, we have English, French, and Espanol. For abstract reasoning, it's English and French, but as I mentioned before, and you're well aware, language is not really an issue for abstract reasoning. And then you can have your practice or exam mode, so simulation or practice, preparation. You can review previous tests, you can retake those tests, and there are lots of functionality, statistics that can help in your preparation. So take a look at the webinars. We have one for abstract verbal numerical reasoning. We have pro tips, and we even have a math refresher if you haven't done math for a long, long time. And many lawyers face that problem, because the last time they had any math problem was back at high school. So make sure to check those out if you are in need of such a refresher. And then the ebook, the tips and tricks, and the free demo are all available on the EU Training's website. And we actually have a classroom training specifically for the pre-selection, the computer-based tests, the abstract verbal numerical, coming up in Brussels. So if you have an interest and you find yourself in Brussels on the 22nd, you're more than welcome to join at our beautiful office and training center, very close to the Commission's headquarters, the Berlaymont building, and you are encouraged and welcome to join that training. Places are limited, tend to sell out very fast. So if you're interested, sign up today. And then on Facebook, we actually created a dedicated group called the EPSO Administrators in the Field of Data Protection. So if you'd like to interact with your fellow competitors, or just call them peers, then you can certainly do that and ask questions or share your challenges or ideas or preparation tips with the others if you feel comfortable enough to do this, and don't consider them mortal enemies in the fight and the quest for those coveted 30 places on the reserve list. My very own book might be helpful to you, the Ultimate EU Test Book. There's an administrator edition, which is relevant for this competition. So if you prefer to practice in writing, all the questions are completely different from the ones on the website, so there is no overlap. And then there's a dedicated book called the Ultimate EU Test Book Assessment Center Edition, which is only dealing with the assessment center and focusing on the various tasks and know-how linked to the assessment center. And then finally, the special discount offer I mentioned, I'll keep this on the screen. It gives you an amazing 19% off, and it's a Data AD 6 2018. It's all caps. Make sure that you use all caps, and it's valid for 2 days, for 48 hours until the 7th of September, so until Friday, 5 p.m. And while I leave it on the screen, I take a look at the other questions that have come in. Let's see. Is it needed? Is a diploma needed for proving that I have worked in data protection field? No, you do not need a diploma to prove it. What you need is some form of proof. Perhaps it might be a certificate. It might be maybe a recommendation letter that they might ask you. Unless they formally require you to prove those claims, you don't need to prove those, but be prepared that if you need to contact a former employer or your boss or the partner, the law firm you work, any of that, then you should be able to provide someone's declaration, certificate, or perhaps even a tax certificate that you did such work. But no diploma, because they are only requiring some degree or a law degree, but there's no requirement for a dedicated data protection degree. Next question. Is it true that the first part of the talent screener selection is automated and only afterwards man-made? I don't think so, but this is something that I would need to check. I don't think so. Some employers do use keyword finding tools and automated systems. I really don't think that EPSO does it. So as far as I know, and again, I need to double check, but as far as I know, they are using only humans and not machines yet to go through each talent screener answer and make sure that they give you scores and points based on what's written there. and not based on the kind of keywords that a computer algorithm might find. If I hear otherwise, we'll let you know. We'll perhaps publish an article or make it public. But again, based on my current understanding and my knowledge and what I hear, this is all human validation that they use. Next question. Will you be organizing additional classroom training sessions in October? Yes, happy to report. On the 27th of October, there's another classroom training. And if a classroom training sells out, still you might want to let us know that you're interested, because we try to cater to your needs, and we might create a new group or a new training based on demand. So make sure that you let us know that you have an interest. Next question. I see at the beginning there was a question. Do I understand correctly that the EDPS, so the European Data Protection Supervisor, will not be one of the agencies recruiting? I need to double check the notice of competition about this. My assumption would be that they themselves also recruit perhaps one or two or more EU officials for their own services. But I need to check it in the notice of competition, because it might be some nuanced wording which provides the answer for this question. It's one thing is for sure, is not the EDPS that's going to hire all these 30 successful laureates who are no longer candidates, but laureates who are on the reserve list. So they might hire some, but others will be hiring more, but they will be the one supervising the work that you do. But again, I need to double check in the notice of competition, or you can do it yourself to properly interpret the data. And if something might be unclear, send us a message and I'll look into it and dig deeper, or perhaps ask others for their opinion. I see there might be another question coming in. Yes, so what is the discount code valid for? It's valid for everything online. So not the classroom and the coaching, not the personal coaching or the physical in-person classroom, but everything else you can use it for the online packages. There's also a comprehensive webinar package for the assessment center. So that's a 2+2, so almost a 4-hour webinar recording about the assessment center. So the code is valid for that as well. And all the abstract, verbal, numerical, reasoning tests, anything else that you find and is available online, the code can be used for. I'll wait a moment or two to see if there are any more questions. If not, you can always send us a message through the contact form on eutraining.eu, and either myself or some member of our team will be available to answer that to the best of our abilities, and to be helpful in your preparation, to be helpful in your success for this very exciting competition for EU data protection officers. I see there's one more question. Do you have insights on the timing? Well, timing is always a guesswork, but once we know how many candidates there are, and that's an information that EPSO usually makes public, they disclose that to the general public, how many candidates have applied. So once you see whether it's in the hundreds or above 500 or even above 1,000, then you can be fairly sure that there's going to be a pre-selection test. They are likely going, again, this is my guesswork, they're likely going to organize those tests at least 4 to 6 weeks from the end of the deadline. So from the 11th of September, probably the second half of October, you might already see some communication about the upcoming tests, the upcoming exams, and how they do it. And then if it's assessment center, my guess would be it's probably going to be around November, December, perhaps next January. So it doesn't go super fast, but still there's a fairly predictable timeline for most of these competitions, usually 4 weeks in between the various phases, or rather 4 to 6 weeks between the various phases, plus if you have holidays like Christmas or the winter holidays, that might add a little more. First and second question of the talent screen are connected to education and EU law and data protection law. Does it mean that for answering both yes, person need to have 3 diplomas? Diploma might not be the most accurate word, because maybe you had an in-house training on that. Maybe you got a certificate from the European Association of Data Privacy or privacy officials or an international body. So diploma to me means a university or a higher education formal qualification. But if you had some sort of formal education in the field, likely though that is sufficient. So it is education. It has to be something that had a curriculum, perhaps from an accredited training or higher education facility, but it doesn't need to be a formal degree that you might have in mind when you use that word. How should we deal with bad translations? Do we report them? Yes, by all means, report them. If it's dubious, if it's confusing, if it's not accurate in the verbal reasoning tests, make sure that you report them. Hopefully you meant this question in the context of EPSO and not our tests, but even if it's our test, make sure to indicate that, and we definitely look into it and do our best to improve the quality. Next one, is it true that first part, yeah, I already answered in terms of the talent screener questions being automated or man-made. We did talk about it. And then the next question, I didn't understand the division of position of the data protection officers competitions. Could you please specify? Division of position of the data protection officer competitions. Could you please specify? I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll look into it closer and try to follow up. So if you could indicate your name to Lenka, or perhaps send an email if you'd like to keep your privacy. After all, it's data protection. Then we'll get back to you bilaterally so we can provide you the most accurate answer that's possible. We have 1 or 2 more minutes if there is any question coming in, and I see Lenka is typing fast on her computer, so she will convey those to me in a moment. Here is one. Is the EDPS lecturer? Yes. Yes, so the European Data Protection Supervisor, whether they are the ones recruiting, and they may recruit the new members as administrators, but again, you will not necessarily be placed in the office of the European Data Protection Supervisor. You could be working in any of the other EU institutions while reporting back to the EDPS. So you could be a data protection officer in the European Parliament or in the European Commission, and that's your actual workplace. But administratively, you report to the EDPS office because they are the ones as an umbrella organization that coordinates and supervises the work of the data protection officers. I think this is where I'll stop. And again, if you have questions or anything comes to mind where we can be helpful, make sure to send an email. Obviously, this is a completely free service, and we are there to help you or find out information that can be helpful to you. So send as many questions as you like through the support, and use the services on eutraining.eu to the best of your abilities and to your benefit, so you can be successful and pass the EPSO competition, placed on the reserve list, and eventually be recruited in a job that hopefully makes your dream come true. So with that in mind, I thank you very much for your attention, and very grateful for all these great questions that we had a chance to answer. Special thanks to Lenka, who was kind enough to coordinate the whole webinar and communicate with many of you and help me answer those questions. So thank you so much, and hope to see you virtually or in person one way or another. This is András Baneth from Brussels, and good luck for the competition. Thanks again for your time.